For better or worse, there are few representations of Americana more iconic than the drive-in movie theater. Okay, that's a total lie. There are many things that are way more representative of Americana, but when it comes to dreaming up an idealized representation of the good old days, whatever the hell those were, we tend to get everything filtered through a Vaseline-smeared lens of small-town America in the 1950s. And the centerpiece of that nostalgic illusion is the drive-in theater. The uncovered halcyon palace, where lobby snacks were handed out like breath mints at a halitosis convention, and the entire social universe of high school living unfolded beneath a silver screen, and sometimes on the screen itself. But underneath that veneer of nostalgic escapism is a tale of technological revolution, an evolving automotive landscape, the rise and fall of the social world that made drive-ins possible, and the improbable resurrection and ongoing survival of a business model that had once been considered erased in the modern era. This is the story of how the drive-in was created, the ongoing war over who invented it, the cars that were immortalized by it, the films that made it a spectacle worth seeking out, and the theaters that made drive-ins matter in the first place. Drive on up and tune your radio to the correct frequency. This is RCR Stories, the complete history of the drive-in movie theater. On April 23, 1915, the Outdoor Theater de Guadalupe in Las Cruces, New Mexico, screened the Sigmund Lubin film Bags of Gold for an audience of roughly 700 people. In later years, some would credit this as the first drive-in movie theater. Yet the thing holding it back from that title was that it wasn't really an open-air theater per se, as the majority of theatergoers were inside of an auditorium while space was made to accommodate about 40 cars inside the grounds of the theater to watch the show. So this isn't really the type of theater we think of when we think drive-in. Yet other claimants would pop up in the years ahead, such as a theater in Comanche, Texas, opened by a man named Claude V. Carver, who got himself a big old plot of land and then opened it to the public for projecting outdoor picture shows. But this too seemed less like a dedicated drive-in and more like one of those community movie nights that happen at the local park or behind the church during the summer. People set up in their cars or on blankets, no concessions and no sound, although whether this also meant no music isn't entirely clear, but I would imagine if it were completely silent, then the awkwardness wouldn't be too far removed from being forced to watch photo slides of your grandparents' vacation. So if it wasn't the Theater de Guadalupe and it wasn't Claude Carver, then who invented the drive-in? Meet Richard Milton Hollingshead Jr., a 32-year-old husband and father of 3 from Camden, New Jersey, who worked as a general sales manager at Whiz Auto Products, an automotive chemical company run by his father. Yet despite being in business with his dad, his game-changing idea was actually inspired by his mother. You see, as a heavier-set woman, Mrs. Hollingshead supposedly had trouble being comfortable in conventional movie theater seating, but she never seemed to have trouble sitting comfortably in the car. Now, not only do big girls deserve love, just like everybody else, they also deserve to enjoy the movies, too. It was as true in 1933 as it is now. And as true for them as it was for Homer Simpson in that one episode where he gains a lot of weight to go on workman's comp. Anyway, Richard began to put together a way for his mother to watch films without being chafed by uncomfortable movie theater chairs, since, again, it's the 1930s, and we don't exactly have the movie taverns that we have now, with the reclining, heated seats, and on-demand food service, and novelty popcorn buckets shaped like Yoshi, or a Jurassic dinosaur's footprint. So Richard set up a Kodak movie projector in his backyard and put up a screen by suspending 2 sheets between a pair of trees. Finding that he had room for multiple vehicles, he set up parking spots that would have a ramp at the front to elevate each car to better see the screen. This way, the cars in back wouldn't have their view obstructed by the cars in front. And what do you know, it actually worked out as an enjoyable experience, although the thrill of coming up with the idea likely pales in comparison to discovering no one had patented the idea yet. So Richard applied to have his drive-in theater concept patented on August 6, 1932. Yet the wheels of bureaucracy move slowly, so it took until May 16, 1933, for the patent to finally come through. However, it was well worth the wait, because now history would recognize Richard Milton Hollingshead Jr. as the inventor of the drive-in movie theater. Having conceived of and originated the first official drive-in theater in the country, Hollingshead took his idea a step further by creating Park-In Theaters Incorporated with the help of his cousin and 2 other investors. And then he went about finding cheap land, figuring out sound logistics, hiring workers, and making contacts in the film industry so he'd actually have movies to show. Luckily, this didn't take long, since the pay rate of 40 cents per hour for experienced workers and 20 cents for day laborers meant Hollingshead had a full crew of willing, able-bodied workers in basically no time at all. To put it in perspective, those wages translate to $10.37 and $5.19 per hour today, respectively. Which, to be fair, doesn't sound like much, but not only was this during the Great Depression, a time where jobs were hard to come by, but it was also during an age in which the cost of living relative to earnings meant you could, for example, get a used 1929 Chevrolet Coach for the non-pipe dream sum of $125. Only about 8% of the highest paid laborer's income, as opposed to now where expenses could climb as high as 20% of your take-home pay. But I digress. From receiving the patent on May 16th, it took just 3 weeks to go from construction to grand opening on America's first automobile movie theater, with the first screenings taking place on June 6, 1933. Advertised as the Drive-In Theater, decent name, probably needs some work, with the slogan, quote, "World's first sit-in-your-car, see and hear movies," end quote, the first feature shown was a picture titled Wives Beware. The screen ran 40 by 50 feet and hosted patrons for 50 cents, assuming you went alone. 25 cents for your admission, and 25 cents for the car. But a flat rate of $1 was charged for 3 or more people, which made it particularly appealing to families who were basically traveling in their own little mobile living room to take the kids out to a picture show, without having to worry about angering other patrons simply for having children, or being made to feel like they were intruding in a place they had every right to be. And look, I'm not saying that screaming, crying children aren't annoying, but it seems like a lot of places are openly hostile to children even existing. Like, no, a kid should not be in a bar, but I mean, it's not the end of the world if a child is in a Walmart. It's not like they're somewhere they're not supposed to be, you know what I mean? But whatever, that's soapbox stuff. Hollingshead understood that parents were often left in the lurch when it came to having outlets for entertainment outside of the home that included the entire family. He would make this one of the primary features of the theater in advertisements by declaring that, quote, "The whole family is welcome, regardless of how noisy the children are." End quote. Maybe it's putting too fine a point on it to say as much, but the drive-in movie theater as a concept bordered on genius. And it actually inspired other entrepreneurs directly. The second drive-in theater to open in the United States wasn't too far from New Jersey. It was Shankweiler's Auto Park in Orfield, Pennsylvania. And the story here is an interesting one because, as it turns out, a hotel owner named Wilson Shankweiler just happened to be driving through New Jersey and caught wind of Hollingshead's theater. He thought it was a great idea, not simply because he himself loved the movies and wanted to bring that sort of attraction to Pennsylvania, but for the secondary reason, or primary reason because capitalism, that such a venue could potentially bring customers to his other businesses, such as the restaurant in the hotel. As Shankweiler told the Allentown Morning Call in 1962, just 1 year prior to his death, quote, "I figured it would be a good idea to have people come to the hotel to eat and then stay for a movie." End quote. Capable of accommodating some 275 automobiles, Shankweiler had taken an open airfield behind his hotel and converted it into an exhibition space for film screenings. The grand opening for Shankweiler's Auto Park was held less than a year after Hollingshead's theater, opening for business on April 15, 1934. Making it one of the only good things to ever happen on tax day. And Shankweiler's approach was modest in a way that was kind of similar to Hollingshead's, as he covered railroad ties with a mound of dirt to create a sort of incline for the cars to view the screen, which was essentially a sheet mounted between two poles. Sound familiar? They mostly showed silent films in those early days, transmitting sound through two large speakers once talking pictures became all the rage. Hot dogs and candy ran a nickel apiece. Today, that's about $1.24. It was reasonably priced entertainment, and before long, Shankweiler's had himself a real business on his hands. With that said, while Richard Hollingshead's idea was capable of inspiring entrepreneurs who encountered it, there was one simple problem. He wasn't the only one to have this idea, or to get it patented. Louis P. Josserand, a Houston, Texas-based architect, had won his own patent for a drive-in movie theater, albeit later than Hollingshead. Except, unlike Hollingshead, Louis P. Josserand had trouble finding investors, so he eventually settled on building an experimental drive-in on a beach in Galveston, Texas, with ramps made from dried, packed sand. Of course, sand isn't really great for cars, no matter how dried and packed, so it made more sense to just pay the 10-cent walk-up fee and leave the car at home, since it was cheaper than paying 25 cents to drive onto the sand and ruin your undercarriage. But here's the thing. If enough people just leave the car at home and pay the walk-up fee, well, then you don't really have a drive-in theater. You have beach blanket broadcasting. Not that semantics prevented Josserand's theater from being a smash hit. In fact, Louis P. Josserand's theater had walk-up and motorized patrons in numbers that were encouraging for the future prospects of the drive-in movie business. But unfortunately for Josserand, the success wouldn't last, for two big reasons. For one, there was a rival patent claim, as there was now a third man claiming to have invented the drive-in movie theater. The businessman, named Herbert Taylor Jr., had his own patent on the drive-in, and he would take Josserand to court for operating his theater, which was really only a theater in the air quotes sense, but the second obstacle Josserand faced was arguably worse than just being sued. Less than a month after the opening of his beachfront drive-in, Josserand's theater was destroyed by Mother Nature as a storm came in and essentially wrecked anything it didn't wash away. And to add insult to injury, no sooner did Josserand's business get destroyed by a storm than a fourth rival claimant arrived to challenge for the title of father of the drive-in movie theater, in the form of a salesman named Phil Smith, who purchased and restored an old 3,000-seat theater in Boston, Massachusetts, and founded a company called General Cinemas. Now, Phil Smith was something of a visionary in the theater-going realm, reducing ticket prices by 15 cents in the early 1920s, long before the Great Depression would necessitate it, and managing to expand his business to some 25 theaters before the 1920s came to a close. Of course, when the Great Depression hit, Smith had to keep his family fed, so he sold all but 3 of his theaters, which kept his business alive a little longer until he decided, hey, I'm going to take a risk on these drive-in movie theaters. You see, he believed it would be the hot new thing in the 1930s. But for reasons that will become clear a bit later, Smith couldn't exactly build the theaters on his home turf, so he branched out, opening locations in Cleveland and Detroit. As his son Richard Smith would tell the LA Times in 1985, Phil Smith may not have been the first to test the concept of screening films outdoors, but he was, quote, the first to commercially operate something successful. He invented the idea of having children come in free and of providing playgrounds to try to make it a family experience. End quote. Basically, if Richard Hollingshead recognized the potential of the drive-in as a place families could go, Smith took it a step further by making it a place families wanted to go. Never mind that the drive-in theater was the only way some families could enjoy a night out at the cinema at all, since, again, nobody is really going to mind noisy kids or a crying baby if all the racket is contained to your car. With kids getting in free, families could feel like they weren't losing money on a night out if the kid didn't enjoy the movie, or if they ended up sleeping through it. And with Smith providing playgrounds, it offered the kids something to do if the parents just wanted some alone time but couldn't get a babysitter. So understandably, Smith had a success on his hands, but he was still just one among many operating in the mid-1930s, as more and more businessmen either independently came up with the idea to build drive-ins or saw how it was working for their competitors. Either way, while drive-ins were still novel, they were becoming less rare, with locations opening up as far south as Florida, as far north as Maine, as far west as California, and as far east as Rhode Island, and plenty of places in between, like Michigan, Maryland, and Virginia. But back to Hollingshead for the moment, because despite being at the ground floor of a veritable gold mine, he struggled to make it profitable under his ownership. In fact, the situation was much more dire than the business not pulling in the revenue it should have been. This was a downright money loser for him. The operating costs were high because land isn't cheap, nor are the taxes you have to pay on all that acreage. And the equipment for a drive-in movie theater isn't much cheaper, and it's often exposed to the elements. Indoor theaters didn't have to worry about these kinds of things, like their screen and scaffolding getting rained on or subjected to, tornado season. The drive-ins were costing Hollingshead more than what they brought in, and so, with no other choice to keep his business afloat, Hollingshead resorted to licensing the rights to operate drive-in movie theaters to any business owner willing to pay a licensing fee. The world-famous Pico Drive-In, originally known as the Pacific, was not only Los Angeles' first drive-in theater, it was the first to pay a licensing fee to Hollingshead and his Park-In Theaters Incorporated. From a business perspective, you'd think licensing fees would be lucrative enough to make the entire drive-in venture profitable. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case, as Hollingshead was, sadly, forced to sell his original location, signing it over to a theater owner in Union, New Jersey, a short 6 miles away. And because fate is a cruel mistress, the drive-in movie theater concept would make strides in popularity nationwide not long after Hollingshead sold it. By the mid to late 1930s, you had theaters like the Drive-In Short Reel Theater in Galveston, Texas, the aforementioned Shankweiler's Auto Park in Orfield, Pennsylvania, and the aforementioned Pico Drive-In, making drive-in movies an American institution. But as with anything that becomes popular, they soon found themselves coming face to face with the law. The Pico Drive-In is legendary for a multitude of reasons. Not only were they the first drive-in theater to license the concept after paying the fee to Richard Hollingshead's Park-In Theaters Incorporated, the Pico was also the first drive-in to have legislation passed due to problems they kept having with law enforcement. You see, the sound system was provided by RCA Victor, a merger between then tech leader RCA, or Radio Corporation of America, and Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden, New Jersey, which itself was the world leader in record and phonograph manufacture. They designed a system that would utilize 3 speakers that essentially projected sound in sync with the movies themselves, since in-car speakers for drive-ins weren't a thing yet, which meant that when going to a drive-in, you pretty much just had to make do with what you could hear from wherever you were parked. And while customers didn't seem that miffed about it, you couldn't say the same about residents. When you have loudspeakers blasting movie dialogue across the neighborhood well into the evening hours, and at times the same dialogue again and again, you're going to get complaints from the locals. So complaints came flowing like air from a punctured tire, and by that December, the district attorney put the wheels in motion to have the loudspeakers banned, so that by February 1935, an official ordinance had passed that made it a misdemeanor to operate any sound amplifying system whose sound could travel more than 50 feet from its property. And just like that, the law had shackled the owner of the Pico, a man by the name of Guy Douthwaite. Except, no it didn't, because Douthwaite completely ignored the order and kept playing movies with the loudspeakers anyway. So, naturally, he was arrested in March 1935, barely a month after the ordinance had passed. Now, how loud were these speakers anyway? For that answer, we look to Guy Douthwaite's trial, which was held in June 1935, at which 2 police officers testified that audio from the drive-in could be heard from well over a mile away from the Pico. Obviously way more than the 50 feet the ordinance allowed. For his part, Douthwaite argued the sound system was necessary for a theater with 487 car capacity, and a screen measuring 60 feet wide by 40 feet high. And yeah, okay, you need a system powerful enough to project sound all the way back to the people in the rearmost rows. He's right. But also, The reality is that the theater isn't going to be at capacity every single night, so sometimes it's just a lot of wasted volume. Yet Douthwaite's defense is that you still need that kind of system in order to overcome the natural ambience of the setting, since you have to account for the sound of nature, other people, and other cars. And it was a sound argument, literally. But when the verdict came in, Douthwaite lost. That's the bad news. The good news is that despite the verdict, the judge suspended his sentence on the condition that he stopped using the loudspeakers and paid a $250 fine, which would be just under $6,000 today. He agreed, and so Douthwaite was a free man. But, in the absence of any other way to convey sound to an audience of nearly 500 cars, at max capacity, Douthwaite had to close the Pico down until he could come up with a solution. He needed to act fast, not only to save a business that had become a cornerstone of the community around Pico and West Boulevard, just a mile southeast of the famous Route 66, he had to act fast to save the jobs of the roughly 30 people he employed in the midst of an economic depression. So Douthwaite went back to the drawing board and sketched out some possible solutions that would allow his drive-in to operate while not being in violation of the sound ordinance. In the expanded second edition of his book, Drive-Ins of Route 66, author Michael Kilgore tells of Douthwaite's ingenuity and persistence. Quote, "Forced to come up with a solution, Douthwaite invented individual car speakers. They were strung in front of the car ramps, and each was attached to a front radiator. The drive-in reopened just a few weeks after it closed. Douthwaite apparently stayed out of jail, running the drive-in for another year before resigning for health reasons in late 1936. End quote. Miraculously, Douthwaite found a way to save the theater, and all he had to do was invent an entirely new way to transmit audio directly to the cars. Light work, obviously. However, Douthwaite sadly would not be around to see the long-term fruits of his success, passing away at just 50 years old following a heart attack in December 1936, not long after resigning from the Pico. Yet his influence could not possibly be overstated, because individual car speakers revolutionized the drive-in movie theater business, as it made the experience even more intimate. At a time before people could watch movies in the safety and comfort of their own homes, a drive-in was as close as you could get to a home box office. With that said, some theaters had a different solution to the noise pollution problem entirely. The fifth drive-in ever built in America was the Weymouth Drive-In over in Weymouth, Massachusetts. Opening on May 28, 1936, the Weymouth was even more formidable than the Pico, servicing a capacity of 600 cars. You know those Arcadia Images of America books you see in Barnes & Noble and in visitor centers? Well, they did a book on Weymouth in 2001, and it contained ad copy from the Weymouth Drive-In that probably wouldn't fly today, but certainly turned heads in the 1930s. Quote, "Elderly, invalids, fat people, and tall people may enjoy the show in comfort and privacy without leaving their cars. Bring the family and even household pets if you wish." End quote. Admission was more expensive than at Hollingshead's Drive-In, but it was the same as the Pico at 35 cents. But overall, it was a cheaper night out because kids under the age of 10 entered free, and there was no charge for the car, which was kind of a big deal. There also weren't restrictions on when you could show up. So if you were late for the last show, which was at 10:30 p.m., you weren't barred entry like you would be at some other movie theaters of the time. And from my research, the Weymouth was the first, or at least one of the first, to really go whole hog on concessions, hiring 6 guys, slapping a uniform on them, and having them go from car to car with a container of refreshments to sell. Sort of like a hot dog or peanut vendor at a ball game, or a car hop at a drive-in restaurant. Yeah, that's actually the more accurate comparison, I think. I don't know why I didn't just go with that. This had the effect of creating more jobs at a time when, as established, Americans were eager to find any kind of work to sustain themselves and their families. Of course, the Weymouth ran into the same noise issues as the Pico. In fact, they actually may have had it worse, since the speakers at the Weymouth weren't behind the screen like they were at other drive-ins. They were on top of the screen, transmitting the audio even farther, such that reports of the time claimed that movies could be heard as far as 5 miles away. Now, you would think in-car speakers would be the solution, and I'm not entirely sure why they weren't adopted here at the Weymouth, other than that perhaps news of Douthwaite's invention hadn't yet reached Massachusetts. Either way, the Weymouth took a different approach when townspeople started complaining. They switched over to pole speakers. While not as ideal as in-car speakers would eventually be, they proved less disruptive to the surrounding community and allowed the theater to grow in popularity, to where they would expand in the decades ahead to 2 screens capable of accommodating 800 cars each. The pole speakers were essentially these small, wired speakers that sat on metal posts between parking spots. You could unhook them from the pole and mount them to the side of your car. By 1948, Shankweiler's Drive-In would also adopt pole speakers and dedicated car speakers to provide the sort of flexibility that allowed their business to expand. However, expansion didn't go smoothly for everyone. As the drive-in wars returned to a familiar theater of combat, the courtroom. We touched on it a bit earlier with the patent wars, but drive-in movie theaters were a fertile ground for the only American pastime older than baseball: litigation. Even with the patent that was awarded to Richard Hollingshead that was then used by his company, Park-In Theaters Incorporated, Hollingshead's claim on royalties was constantly being challenged in court, because there was the argument that you couldn't really patent a movie theater in any meaningful way, since the notion of displaying motion pictures on a screen to a paying audience wasn't exactly a unique concept, even if this version involved cars. The Weymouth Drive-In over in Massachusetts wasn't a direct competitor to Hollingshead necessarily, but the success of that theater would change the landscape of the drive-in business, because it would attract some unwanted attention. You see, before opening the Weymouth, no one had apparently thought to obtain a licensing agreement from Hollingshead or Park-In Theaters for the right to operate a drive-in. Either that, or they just didn't know it was something they had to do. Or the third option, that they knew but didn't really think it was worth it. Because, I mean, to get in trouble, someone has to notice, and then someone has to care enough to do something about it, right? Besides, Hollingshead is all the way in New Jersey. Surely word won't carry that far, right? Except New Jersey really isn't that far away from Massachusetts, and also, if The Sopranos taught me anything about Jersey, it's that you really don't want to muscle in on another crew's territory without giving them a cut. Hell, Wilson Shankweiler had to pay Hollingshead a 5-cent royalty on every car that came to his theater in order to open up his drive-in. So yeah, there wasn't really any use trying to escape the watchful eye of Park-In Theaters Incorporated if you were planning to operate a drive-in movie theater on the East Coast. Now, the Weymouth Drive-In was operated under the heading of a separate company, the Drive-In Theaters Corporation. But to Hollingshead, a thief by any other name was still a thief. The battle lines were drawn. Richard Hollingshead and Park-In Theaters Incorporated versus the Weymouth Drive-In and Drive-In Theaters Corporation. And it would only get uglier from here. As written in the book, Drive-In Theaters, A History from Their Inception in 1933 by Carrie Seagrave, Park-In Theaters made the bold move in 1936 to recoup something from Weymouth and their Drive-In Theaters Corporation by means of undermining some of their biggest box office nights of the year. Quote, on July 3rd that year, Park-In brought an action against the Weymouth in the United States District Court in Massachusetts, charging patent infringement. Obtaining a writ of attachment, Park-In placed keepers at the Weymouth the nights of July 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 1936, taking possession of the entire gate for those nights. They also attached certain funds of the Weymouth Company. The total take was reported to be $5,000. End quote. Hollingshead essentially sent his own men to commandeer the profits of a lucrative holiday from a rival theater owner. But you could also argue that from an infringement standpoint, they didn't really do anything wrong, they were simply taking what they were owed. To give some perspective on how much money was commandeered, $5,000 in 1936 is roughly equivalent to over $117,500 in 2026. A hefty chunk of change. Now, Park-In Theaters is a name you're going to hear a lot more in place of Richard Hollingshead, but they're legally synonymous, so just roll with me here. You see, following the July 4th holiday incident, the Weymouth's owners, operating as the Drive-In Theater Corporation, eventually entered into a licensing arrangement with Park-In that would give the Weymouth exclusive rights to drive-in theaters in the New England region. Because once you have a rival theater owner commandeering all of your July 4th holiday ticket sales, it's probably better to just pay the licensing fee so that you don't risk having that happen again. So the Weymouth would pay Park-In a licensing fee, along with an additional $1,000 fee for each additional drive-in theater that Drive-In Theater Corporation built in the area. And they would give Park-In a 5% cut of the box office per location. In exchange, Park-In would go after any theater chains that tried to muscle in on Weymouth's territory. It wasn't a perfect deal for Weymouth, but it wasn't entirely unreasonable, I suppose. At least Park-In wasn't taking a majority share of their profits, you know? And hey, they were getting protection on their home turf without having to foot the bill to take other theaters to court if they tried to intrude on their territory. It was like paying a very expensive protection racket. Except this partnership between Park-In Theaters Incorporated and the Drive-In Theater Corporation would be put to the test sooner rather than later. Meet theater owner Elias Lowe, no relation I'm aware of to the later Lowe's theater chain that was absorbed into AMC way back in 2006, and not even the good AMC either. It's the one that has all of those really obnoxious Nicole Kidman ads in front of every movie. Elias Lowe was an immigrant from Austria who arrived in the United States in 1911 and worked his way out of poverty through odd jobs for whoever would hire him, until he had enough money to open his own movie theater at the absurdly young age of 18. By the 1930s, he was one of the most successful theater owners, if not the most successful, in all of New England. And it stayed that way until July 1937, when Elias Lowe opened up a drive-in theater in the town of Lynn, Massachusetts, which would have been Weymouth territory, Naturally, Park-In Theaters would sue Elias Lowe into the Stone Age, right? If not to protect the Weymouth, then to at least go after Lowe for operating without licensing. But for whatever reason, Park-In Theaters let it slide. Naturally, this angered Weymouth and their drive-in theater corporation. So they took Park-In Theaters to court to force them to hold up their end of the licensing agreement. Park-In Theaters Incorporated played their Uno reverse card and sued Drive-In Theater Corporation right back, pointing out that the owners of the Weymouth Drive-In had built an additional theater in Massachusetts without paying the agreed-upon licensing fee for that theater. Both sides denied any wrongdoing, the case stalled, and it was eventually thrown out entirely, from what I could find. So Park-In didn't get the judgment they wanted, but at least they didn't lose. Which wouldn't be true the next time Park-In landed in a court of law. After the lawsuit with Drive-In Theater Corporation fell through, Park-In Theaters Incorporated decided to sue two California businessmen for opening a theater without a license. Now, by this point you could argue Park-In was being overly litigious, and maybe you'd be right. But by the same token, I think you could maybe argue that it's a matter of necessity, because you have to defend your patents, no? Of course, the counter-argument is that Park-In didn't go after Elias Lowe, so there was a bit of a double standard at play. Why are you going after these California businessmen who are on the other side of the country rather than the theater owners with whom you share a coast? I mean, it just seems like the arrow is being aimed at the wrong target. On the one hand, it feels opportunistic and petty to go after one theater owner but not the other. On the other hand, I imagine it's difficult to be aware of every small-town business owner trying to open up a theater in some ramshackle hollow in the middle of God's green nowhere, especially in the 1930s. So I would think some theaters just slipped through the cracks, but not these California theater owners, it would seem. Either way, emboldened by what seemed like a clear-cut case of infringement, Park-In sued in California court. And, well, it would have been better for Park-In had they never brought this legal action at all. When the California courts received this case, a judge made the determination that the lawsuit had no basis, on the premise that Park-In had patented something that, in essence, couldn't be patented in the first place. The fact that the United States Patent Office had awarded Richard Hollingshead the patent for a drive-in movie theater at all was immaterial to the case at hand. To the California court system, a drive-in movie theater did not fall under the category of an invention that could even be patented. Hollingshead fought back tooth and nail and eventually got the case in front of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In their decision, they chose to reverse the ruling of the lower court, or more specifically, they validated that a drive-in could be patented, without necessarily speaking to the validity of Hollingshead's specific patent, which could now be challenged, it would seem. So even by winning, Hollingshead still kinda lost. But it wasn't all bad news for Richard Hollingshead. Sure, Park-In had a hard time enforcing the patent, and they found themselves running afoul of theater owners across the country anytime they tried. But by now, Lowe's Drive-In Theaters Incorporated did a 180 and actually obtained the proper licensing from Park-In under the same terms as the Weymouth deal. They went ahead and opened their own theater in Massachusetts and another in Rhode Island, and in this way, Hollingshead and Park-In Theaters Incorporated actually made money in 1937 with their cut of licensing fees and box office receipts from participating theaters. But things would sour just one short year later when Lowe's Drive-In reopened for the 1938 season. The honeymoon was over, and Lowe's Drive-In Theaters sort of just decided they weren't going to pay Park-In anymore. Hollingshead sued, and the case dragged out well into the 1940s, with Lowe's arguing that for park-in theaters to have a leg to stand on, they would have had to go after all the other unlicensed drive-ins that had popped up by that point, which they didn't do, despite Lowe petitioning them to do just that. The irony here, of course, is that Lowe was now in the same position Weymouth had been in when Park-In chose not to go after him for running an unlicensed theater. Park-In mounted a defense that because there was no official written communication that proved Lowe had actually informed them about any of these unlicensed theaters, they had no way to know about them. So the judge sided with Park-In, and the case was thrown out in another rare win for Hollingshead and Park-In theaters. However, good news for Park-In would be in short supply in the years ahead. Out of the nearly 300 drive-in theaters operating in the United States at this time, Park-In only had licensing deals with around 50 of them. Hollingshead continued to enter into litigation with some of these unlicensed theaters, and even some of those who had taken out licenses but neglected to pay. He sued the president of Paramount Richards Theaters Incorporated and argued that not only was he not being paid royalties, but his opponents had acted in conjunction with the powerful Paramount studio by blocking supply of any new films to Park-In Theater's original Camden location. Hollingshead argued that it was this blacklisting that forced his original location to close, and put him in such a dire financial position that he had to sell the drive-in licenses for well below their market value just to stay afloat. But unfortunately for Hollingshead, his claims were difficult to prove in court, and his lawsuit was unsuccessful. Yet it wouldn't be Hollingshead's final indignity, as the decision ahead was worse than he or any other claimant to the title of drive-in movie theater inventor could have ever imagined. And it all started with one of the most significant events in world history.
Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor. Nurses, soldiers, children of Pearl Harbor. Stabbed in the back. But remembering is not enough. Hating is not enough. Sacrifices. Sure, you've bought bonds and stamps. But when you buy this week, mark in your memory their bonds of vengeance. When you leave this theater, stop and remember that cruel morning just a year ago. Each day this week in motion picture theaters throughout the land, Americans are remembering with vengeance in their hearts. Tears, too. Why not?
The Great Depression had passed, and the U.S. was in economic recovery. That is, until the events of December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and brought the United States into the Second World War. Now, while it's true that the war resulted in all domestic automobile production being suspended, that didn't exactly preclude people going to the drive-in in existing cars, except for the problem that the war had suddenly made it costlier than ever to actually go to the drive-in due to two small words with big implications: fuel rationing. In 1942, German U-boats decided to make oil tankers their target of choice. By the spring of that year, gasoline deliveries were severely reduced, and rationing had to be instated. To make matters worse, there was a rubber shortage as well, which meant popping a tire meant you probably weren't getting another one. And not everybody is a Henry Ford type with the money to buy up their own Brazilian town to produce rubber for them. As a result, not only were tires rationed, driving itself was restricted to prevent wear and tear. For example, the speed limit was reduced nationwide to just 35 miles per hour, on the premise that the faster you were going, the faster you were going to wear down your tread, and Uncle Sam was as stingy with rubber as a college senior with a latex allergy. People were encouraged to commute using public transportation, but even that ended with employers staggering shifts to relax the toll it was taking on the public transportation infrastructure. A lesson that it would have been great for Atlanta to learn prior to the snowpocalypse of 2014, but that's a story for another day. I'm sure you can guess why this affected drive-in movies. Namely, people couldn't afford to spend their precious gas on entertainment. I mean, it was almost like 2020, with citizens being encouraged to quote-unquote vacation at home. And so the drive-in theater business suffered for this reason, as well as the additional problem that even when people were coming to the drive-in, you couldn't make as much money as an indoor theater because you couldn't hold as many showings, since you couldn't actually start screenings until after sundown. Owners tried implementing tent-like coverings to allow for screenings to begin earlier in the day, but that's just an indoor theater with extra steps. None of them really worked in creating the type of theatrical atmosphere of an indoor movie theater, and outright failed in recreating what the best of a nighttime drive-in could offer. Because after all, the appeal of a drive-in theater is not always so much about the movie as it is about the environment in which it was being screened. So yeah, it was bad times for drive-ins. However, unlike so many other businesses, it seemed clear that a boom would be waiting for drive-in movie theaters on the other side of this war. Just not for everyone. And this is where we come to that final indignity visited upon Richard Hollingshead. A case was brewing in the First Circuit Court of Appeals to decide the validity of movie theater patents, full stop. And it arguably came as a consequence of the war, because when that war ended, everybody wanted to get out, go celebrate, go to movies again. And suddenly the drive-in theater was more in demand than it had ever been, leading to more theaters popping up, which resulted in more court cases that eventually kind of forced the system to make a final ruling on movie theater patents altogether. And it would affect not only Richard Hollingshead and Park-In Theaters, but Louis P. Josserand and Herbert Taylor Jr., two other claimants to the drive-in theater patent. On April 8, 1949, in a crushing 3-0 decision, the First Circuit Court ruled that a drive-in movie theater did not meet the necessary standard of invention to constitute a patentable creation. Even Hollingshead's idea to create a sloping ramp to give cars in the rear a better, unobstructed view was deemed insufficient since it was merely an offshoot of what traditional movie theaters were already doing with their own raised seating. The court ruling would state that even if walk-in theaters weren't already doing this, quote, anyone with even ordinary perception would certainly realize that the vertical angles of the automobiles would have to be adjusted with reference to the height of the screen. End quote. So according to the court, it wasn't exactly a huge innovation. To make matters worse, Hollingshead also lost his appeal against Paramount Richards Theaters, which he took all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, who declined to even hear it. In a last-ditch attempt to save his business, Hollingshead would appeal the decision on his patent, only to lose that case as well. Upon his defeat, Hollingshead would declare, quote, there ought to be an award in the industry for ideas which built it, like the Oscars. It might stimulate the industry. But as for me, I can assure you I'm not going to think up any more ideas for the motion picture industry. Why should I lie awake nights to think up anything? To me, the drive-in stands in the category of the greatest contribution to the industry since sound. Yet, since I began the drive-in theater 15 years ago, I've received very little. Even from this viewpoint, it seems a shame that a person who creates and develops a new idea and goes through the procedure set down by law to obtain a patent cannot obtain remuneration when his patent gives everyone else profits. We're never going to create a better country if we kill initiative, and initiative depends on remuneration. End quote. Hollingshead wanted compensation, or as he put it, remuneration. And I get it. What had occurred during the period of all this litigation was an unprecedented growth Hollingshead missed out on ever cashing in on in the way he probably should have. Yet I'm not entirely sure there was any way for him to have done so, because, for whatever reason, his own theaters just didn't succeed in the way his competitors did. So licensing was the next best thing, but to have the court essentially tell you that you can't patent this thing you created because it was never that unique or inventive in the first place, that's gotta be devastating. Regardless, the end result of the court decision on the patent was twofold. Hollingshead was essentially driven out of the movie business, yes, but it also led to the true expansion of drive-ins nationwide, because anybody who was wary about opening a drive-in for fear of being sued over licensing fees no longer had to worry about any of that. The concept of a drive-in theater was the intellectual property of absolutely no one, which meant it was fair game for everyone. In 1947, there were 155 theaters in the United States. By 1951, there were 4,151. The glory days for the drive-in theater had finally arrived, but they came with a cost. And so we enter the 1950s, the salad days of the drive-in movie theater, or at least one half of the two-part peak that culminated in the 1960s. Just as before, families loved how accessible and inexpensive these theaters were in comparison to other activities they could do, with some drive-in owners picking up on this and beginning to offer amenities like diaper vending machines, mini golf courses, and even free bottle warmers to keep babies nice and quiet during the movie. There were even some rare places that erected motels around the theater so you could essentially watch the film from the comfort of your bedroom window. Although this kind of defeats the purpose of the term drive-in, but money's money. Of course, drive-in movies weren't exactly where you'd go if you wanted to see films like Best Picture winner All About Eve, or musicals like Annie Get Your Gun, or comedies with big stars like Spencer Tracy and Elizabeth Taylor in Father of the Bride. I mean, you could see movies like that there, but not as frequently as you could at traditional brick-and-mortar theaters, at least from what I've read. Yes, drive-ins would sometimes get a major first-run feature, but there was an issue that prevented that from happening more often. If you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned how drive-ins were limited to only screening films at night, since you had to wait for the sun to go down to be able to project onto the screen. Movie studios tend to make more money with more screenings, so it didn't really benefit them to send their best movies to the drive-in, even if there were more drive-ins now than ever before. And this decision had a kind of bizarre side effect. As author Robin T. Reed would write in Smithsonian Magazine's The History of the Drive-In Movie Theater, the limitations of screening availability led to the campiness for which drive-in theaters would become famous, noting that with all the first-run features being spoken for by brick-and-mortar theaters, quote, drive-ins were left to show B movies and, eventually, X-rated ones. And being naughty helped some drive-ins survive. End quote. The X rating is basically what we'd think of as an NC-17 rating in America today. An R-rated movie still allows teens 17 and under to attend, so long as they're accompanied by a parent or guardian. But X movies, like NC-17 films, meant that it didn't matter if you had a guardian or not, you weren't getting in if you were under 17. Which is why these types of films were so controversial, because they essentially took the drive-in's key demographic and then locked them out of attendance. But while X ratings may have prevented some teenagers from attending, the boom of the drive-in also brought about the rise of B movies, or lower-budget films that were paired with a higher-budget A movie as part of a double bill. Because if a studio is going to send you a top-of-the-line first-run film, but its runtime doesn't fill out the entire showtime that's been allotted, it makes sense to throw a B movie on there as part of a double feature. B movies from this period featured endearing, lovable schlock, like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Monster on the Campus, Teenagers from Outer Space, The Amazing Colossal Man, and one of the most iconic films in the history of Pennsylvania, The Blob, which sees an annual reenactment take place where the titular character attacked. It's an entire thing around here and it's fantastic, but every year there's a reenactment where people dress up in period-appropriate costumes as if they're fleeing in terror from the Blob. It's so great, you gotta look it up. So while X-rated movies may have locked teens out of participation, B movies helped fill in the gaps to support double feature showings. But okay, that's all well and good. But I think the success of the drive-in movie theater had another sociological component, and it's fairly obvious, I think. On the one hand, it was the cars. On the other hand, it was what the cars and, by extension, the drive-in represented. If cars represented freedom to young Americans, then the drive-in represented a sort of independence from societal norms. Sure, the car provided flexibility of movement, but going to a drive-in offered something akin to having your own apartment after years of worrying about a parent bursting in every time you wanted to get handsy. If you had booze, you brought booze. If you had other recreational refreshments, well, you brought those too. People were kissing, necking, and doing things that you probably wouldn't want happening in an area whose reputation was built on being safe for families. But before long, the drive-in became the domain of the American teenager. It was a place to hang out, irrespective of the movie playing. Those kids who celebrated the end of the war at the drive-in with their reunited families were now teenagers with driver's licenses, taking dates in a Buick Skylark because bench seats meant you could get closer than you could in a packed theater where you had your date on one side and a stranger on the other. But you could also go there to hang out with friends as a sort of communal, paid meeting space, like what the mall would be in the 80s. Even a loner could probably feel like part of the social ecosystem just by being in that environment on a Friday or Saturday night. It was one big cool kids table. It also fed into the car culture of that era, because obviously you couldn't have the drive-in experience without a car. It's almost a cross-generational similarity for teenage social life to revolve around cars. And this was no different in the 1950s than it is today, even as teenagers generally have fewer places to go that are open, aren't hostile to their presence, and aren't cost prohibitive. Either way, teens could go to a drive-in restaurant, just park, and have roller skate-wearing car hops bring them burgers and fries. Or they could go to the drive-in theater. I mean, they could do both, and naturally, yeah, they did. And of course, there were other options, but this video isn't about sock hops, sleepovers, drag racing, and make-out point, you know? So, What cars did people typically drive to the drive-in? Well, I've combed over accounts from the period, although it's clearly all anecdotal since I don't know that this has ever been meaningfully measured in any scientific way. But it's hard for me to think of the drive-in without the Ford Fairlane. It wasn't just one of the best-selling models Ford had made up to that point, but it was also their flagship, full-size model. Now, while you might think this would hamper its appeal as a drive-in movie car, the Fairlane accommodated the experience through sheer roominess. Yes, teenagers could drive it. Teenagers did drive it. But the drive-in, as we've established, wasn't just for teenagers. This was the perfect family vehicle for a movie night, as it measured 16 inches longer than the Ford Falcon, which meant you didn't have to cram people into it. You had space. But what really made these ideal for the drive-in was the newly introduced panoramic windshields. Well, newly introduced for Ford. Buicks and Cadillacs were already using these. But the 1955 Ford placed the A-pillars at a vertical angle for improved visibility. Along those same lines, you had the Ford Galaxy, which started as a trim level on the Fairlane, if I remember correctly, and was 12 inches longer as well. And it's a cool-looking car. I should know. I watched Brian spend a year getting one into perfect shape for his Crazy Taxi. However, you could argue that the Galaxy wasn't as family-geared as the Fairlane. Of course, the length of the Galaxy is also something I'd think would hold it back as an ideal drive-in car, just because it seems like it'd be a chore to get it in and out of parking spaces, particularly if the lot is crowded. But what the Galaxy lacked in nimble maneuverability, it reclaimed through style and just by being top-optional. Toptional, if you will. It was perfect for those balmy summer night showings, and in that sense the Ford Falcon would make a lot of sense too. Basically, in an effort to keep pace with their competitors, Ford ended up crafting one drive-in movie car after another, probably without even realizing that's what they were doing. Except it's not like Ford had the drive-in market cornered. For instance, Chevrolet debuted the Corvette in 1953, ushering in an American icon that would endure for more than 70 years and counting, and it offered drive-in capable features like a hydraulic retracting roof. It was the perfect complement to the family leanings of the Chevrolet Bel Air. Because, don't you just see a Bel Air and think this is something that belongs at a drive-in? Especially the revamped one for 1955, which GM called the Hot One, which is an ironic name since its most attractive drive-in movie feature was the optional air conditioning it got that year. But if you went without the AC, you found yourself with a very reasonably priced car, as the two-door sedan went for just over $2,000, which is around $24,386 today. To this day, the Bel Air remains one of the most popular and recognizable cars of that era, so it's easy to imagine how prevalent these were in their own time. With that said, Oldsmobile belongs in the conversation as well, with the Oldsmobile 88, a full-sized American beauty that was among the early kings of the drive-in theater's golden age. Its quote-unquote futuramic body style was lower, wider. It had this futuristic, almost pontoon style, with the same sort of wraparound or full-view windshields that Ford had, but I believe they had it earlier than Ford did. Either way, the visibility wasn't being obstructed by thick and restrictive A-pillars, you know? So it doesn't just look like it belongs, but it behaves as though it does as well. Meanwhile, 1956 models of the Chrysler New Yorker were not only capable of seating 6, some even featured a record player system under the dash, known as the Highway Hi-Fi system, so you could just put on records and jam out while you waited for the movie to start. Granted, that's not really a drive-in specific feature now that I say it out loud, but I don't think it would hurt, provided you aren't blasting music during the movie. The Cadillac Eldorado, meanwhile, had tail fins that were visually striking enough that nobody would have a hard time finding it after running to go get concessions. No need to try and remember where you were parked. Although I will say that the tail fins were so long by 1959 that I don't envy the spacing or visibility of anybody who had to park behind one. Oh! The Chevy Special Deluxe also deserves a mention here, if for no other reason than for the vacuum-powered windshield wipers, which helped with visibility if Mother Nature decided to start acting up mid-movie, since a lot of theaters operated under rain or shine policies and would only cancel a showing in the event of dangerously inclement weather. Now, this list is in no way intended to be comprehensive, but I will say that I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out the Ford Thunderbird as one of the prime golden age drive-in cars precisely because it had less room than any of the other cars mentioned. Yes, it had the maneuverability of a smaller car with the same generous windshield dimensions of your larger sedans, but you could argue that what made it special was how much more intimate it was than the larger family sedans because there wasn't much room to be anywhere but right up next to your date. And considering what a lot of teens went to the drive-in to do, that pretty much made the T-Bird the ideal car for the occasion. In fact, by the 1960s, drive-ins had even earned the name passion pits because of their reputation as a hormonal cesspool. But ultimately, I find this era to be one of the more fascinating in American automotive history, in that this period was arguably a forerunner to how automakers look to other fields of consumer interest today to inform how they build or promote their cars. These days, they'll look to the tech space to see how best to capitalize on whatever technology has captured the public interest. But in the 1950s, it became clear that drive-ins were a consideration in how cars were marketed, even if they weren't a key motivator in how they were actually built. The wraparound windshields, the air conditioning, and the radio units with more robust sound systems were all part of a package whose appeal was its utility for drive-in movies, even if they weren't literally built with those spaces in mind. Bench seating is one thing, but if you look at those old station wagons with the rear-facing seating in the back, it just feels like something designed for drive-ins, right? You back into the spot, open the tailgate, and it's like watching a movie on your couch. And you can sort of see this mentality in Ford's advertisements for their station wagons of the period, such as the Country Squire. The 1959 brochure for Ford's station wagon lineup would not only promote the roominess of these cars, but how they allowed married couples to have a night out at the drive-in without having to pay for a babysitter. Quote, "Note the wagon at the drive-in theater. Mother and Dad are in the front seat. The rear of the wagon is padded. Toys are strewn around. Under a coverlet, 2 tots are sound asleep. The wagon is a traveling nursery, and Mom and Dad are their own babysitters." End quote. I have no idea why that needed an accent. It didn't need an accent. I was feeling silly. You know, I do silly things sometimes. Now, automakers were aware of the drive-in's blossoming role in car culture, and so they marketed their cars accordingly, especially the family wagons that could essentially make a living room out of any parking spot they could fit into, and even some they couldn't. And the understanding of this utility would be inherited by the teens to whom those cars were passed down. I don't think it's that controversial to say that the cars were more essential to the memory of the drive-in theater than any film that was ever shown on their screens. Yes, because it's the drive-in, but also because cars are often our earliest form of independence. And while youthful freedom often manifests in the simple act of driving, the reality of having a place to go just further crystallized the idea that freedom of movement is nice, but it's more meaningful when it has a destination. Yet, the incredible success of the drive-in theater had more causes than you might think. Some compelled by surprising gimmicks, and others by a shameful, unfortunate truth of American history. Into the 1960s, the amount of drive-ins nationwide remained around 4,000 theaters, an impressive number by any metric. They were more successful than I think even Richard Hollingshead Jr. could have envisioned, and they were relevant to the box office landscape. A report by Variety at the time, cited by The Hollywood Reporter in 2020, indicated that drive-ins accounted for some 23% of box office returns annually. But the cracks in the armor were also there too, as more theaters resorted to gimmicks to keep attendance high. For example, some theaters would have petting zoos, with one Massachusetts theater offering free photographs for any child who rode Poncho the Wonder Pony. Some drive-ins would have monkeys on premises. Other theaters would feature live music, host celebrity guests to promote their films, and hold contests for prizes as small as free admission and as grand as a ride in a hot air balloon. Because the natural evolution of the drive-in theater was a fly-in. Of course, nobody would ever be crazy enough to make a fly-in theater. The first fly-in theater opened back in 1948 with an ex-Navy pilot by the name of Edward Brown Jr., who took a World War I tank, bulldozed some land next to an airstrip, and created a space large enough to accommodate both cars and planes. It was a novel idea, but Brown knew as well as anyone that pilots needed a night out every now and then, too. Like Richard Hollingshead Jr., Brown also founded his theater in the Garden State, opening in Wall Township, New Jersey, with space for 500 cars and 25 airplanes. How did it work? Well, basically the last row in the theater, along with the adjacent airfield, was kept perpetually open for planes. They would land on the airfield and then taxi to the vacant back row. For just 25 cents, they could enjoy a movie from the comfort of whatever craft they were flying, with the promise of a jeep to tow them back to the airfield once the show was over. They could also order dinner from eateries on premises that would then be delivered to their plane. Fly-ins were rare, but unique enough to catch on regionally, spreading to other locations like Massachusetts and Iowa, to name a few. And while they didn't last as long as traditional drive-in theaters, there were supposedly still fly-in drive-ins kicking in the 1960s and sometime after. The 1960s also witnessed another evolution of the drive-in theater that would grow into widespread use into the 1970s and 1980s. Those pole speakers with the individual units you could mount onto the car windows had been the norm since the days of Guy Douthwaite, but it gradually became a greater expense than I think a lot of theaters could justify. Not that they really had a choice, considering the lack of alternatives at the time. It seemed like these speakers were gradually becoming kind of a cost sink. Even just ignoring that people would sometimes steal these speakers, you still had to deal with Mother Nature, like Shankweiler's Drive-In Theater, one of the more recurring drive-ins we've been talking about here. Because you see, in 1955, Hurricane Diane destroyed their screen, their projection booth, and their other equipment, prompting Shankweiler to rebuild at great expense. And while they were able to build a new projection booth and snack bar, and got a new CinemaScope movie screen out of it, the old speaker units remained. And they were as vulnerable to the elements as they were to the stupidity of reckless teenagers. And so advertisements of the time frequently reminded patrons of the theater to replace their speakers back onto their cradles before leaving. But people didn't always do this. And while I couldn't find exact figures for what each unit cost, I can't imagine these speakers were cheap to replace. So theater owners were obviously invested in finding an alternative. Now, the speakers of the day already utilized low-power, localized radio transmission for sound through the aforementioned mounted speakers. But with the standardization and widespread growth of radios inside of cars throughout the 50s and the 1960s, theater owners realized they didn't really need the window speakers anymore. After all, if the car a patron arrives in can receive low-power, localized radio transmissions directly to their car, then why should they have to pay the additional expense of a window-mounted speaker? Of course, the problem with this is that anybody in a used, older model car without a standard radio unit was basically locked out of the drive-in theater experience, which is why drive-ins that adopted radio transmission in those early days still kept the old window speakers, specifically to accommodate these patrons. At least that's my understanding. And yet, either way, it was still a major change to the way drive-in theaters did business, and it was catalyzed by technological advancement within the automotive industry. It was a time of considerable reinvention in some ways, and a time of shameful stagnation in others. While change was soon coming, the 1960s remained characterized by division. Movie theaters were still segregated. I initially wrote here that this was part of a shameful period in American history, yet I can't stand here and pretend that we don't still live in an age where people look down their noses and spew hatred over the color of another person's skin. Ignorance, sadly, will always exist, and in the 1960s that ignorance was legally enforced. But just because stupidity has a law behind it doesn't make it right. And in cases where laws are unjust and people are unfairly discriminated against, the marginalized will always fight back. In his guest column for The Hollywood Reporter in 2020, author Thomas Doherty talked about the setbacks facing Black Americans and their freedom to do something as simple as attending a movie. Basically, the laws against interracial theater attendance had failed to anticipate non-traditional forms of exhibition. In that sense, drive-ins were among the few venues excluded from segregation laws. In a traditionally segregated theater, Black patrons had to purchase their ticket at a different window from everybody else, and in some they would then have to walk around back and take the alleyway entrance, sometimes even having to climb up a fire escape to reach the area in which they were allowed to watch movies. It seemed like the idea was to keep Black patrons out of the theaters altogether by making it a pain in the ass to even go in the first place. But what are you going to do about a drive-in? It's outside. Which is not to say that drive-ins didn't still experience racial segregation, but what I am saying is that, from what I've read, enforcing segregation appeared to be a touch more difficult in a drive-in than it was in a traditional theater, because people fought back by just wearing the man down. As Doherty writes, quote, "At the drive-in, the desegregation campaign inspired an apt variation, a kind of drive-in at the drive-in. You just drive up your car to the entrance and automatically block the way until they sell you a ticket," explained an activist moviegoer to a local paper in May 1960. End quote. Yet still, segregation prevailed in the South and in other areas where Black Americans were deemed second-class citizens for no reason other than blind hatred. While this meant some Black motorists were denied entry altogether or exposed to Klan activity, in other cases, this simply meant that now all Black drive-ins were erected, adding to the nationwide total of drive-in screens, as well as the number of Black-owned businesses in the country, which you could argue is a good thing that came about for the wrong reasons. But a contingent of the population were no longer putting up with being limited to segregated spaces. As the civil rights movement took hold, so too did a reclamation of the spaces from which Black citizens had been unjustly barred. Doherty details the protests that sparked the move towards integration. Quote, "Just as the activists staged sit-ins at diners, they staged stand-ins at movie houses. That is, black moviegoers stood in line at segregated theaters and politely requested a ticket at the box office window. When they were refused admission, they walked to the end of the line and repeated the process. Another tactic was for white allies to buy 2 tickets and then attempt to walk with their black partners into the white section or segregated balcony, where ushers would block their entry. Exhibitors were tormented with clogged lines and interrupted shows." End quote. And so protesters were doing a standing version of what was happening at the drive-in, getting rejected from being able to purchase a ticket and then just looping back around and trying again and just wearing the man down. But as conflict intensified at standing movie theaters, so too did the battle for civil rights grow more perilous at drive-in movie theaters. As Doherty notes, a North Carolina chapter of the Klan burned a wooden cross in front of a theater screening the Harry Belafonte picture, Island in the Sun. The protests and counter-protests and counters to the counter-protests continued nationwide, and the conflict became injurious to the bottom line of theater owners, until theater owners gave up the fight and began to integrate. It happened little by little, but it happened. Because change is incremental, but it's still possible. Naturally, some areas resisted until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 took the decision out of their hands. Not that it made these theaters welcoming to black moviegoers, even if they were now welcome in the eyes of the law. For all the success of the drive-in theater during this period, it will always be sad and infuriating to know that not everyone was granted the ability to enjoy a night out without having to endure bigotry. It's just so dumb. It really is. And I'll get off my soapbox now, but my hope for the future in perpetuity is that society can one day leave all of that hatred behind, because there's nothing of bigotry worth preserving. Now, with black Americans being granted admission into theater spaces across the country, you'd think we'd see an increase in the cultural relevance of the drive-in theater, right? And you'd be half correct, if for no other reason than that the drive-in had become such an ingrained part of youth culture that it was difficult to disentangle its existence from the American experience. However, by the mid-1960s, it was starting to become apparent that the novelty was wearing thin. Sure, drive-ins were still mostly popular, but you began to see even more gimmicks to get people in the door. Not just petting zoos and hot air balloons either. No, theater owners were renting out to other activities, like speaking events, like markets and Sunday church services, because they had all this land that cost more money to hold on to than the theater could bring in. Despite there still being consistent enough patronage from all these gimmicks that the theaters should have still been making decent income. But if they still had enough regular customers that they should have still been making money, then why were more and more theaters resorting to desperate tactics to stay afloat? I mean, what on earth happened? This is still the golden age of the drive-in theater, technically. These theaters should not be having such a hard time making enough money to sustain continued operations, so why are they having such a struggle here? And the answer is 3 words: daylight savings time. One of the biggest hurdles drive-ins had to face during their peak years was Congress passing the Uniform Time Act of 1966. Enacted on April 13, 1966, the Uniform Time Act was intended to, quote, promote the observance of a uniform system of time throughout the United States, end quote. As explained in a National Geographic interview with Bill Moseley, An officer of public affairs for the Department of Transportation, the Uniform Time Act was a necessary progression for a nation as large as the United States. Quote, "In the early 19th century, localities set their own time. It was kind of a crazy quilt of time zones, and time usage. When the railroads came in, that necessitated more standardization of time so that railroad schedules could be published." End quote. It was the railroad industry that created the concept of standard time zones for each region of the United States in the late 1800s, so that by 1918, Congress signed it into law. And the Standard Time Act of 1918 also governed how daylight savings time was observed until that part of the law was repealed and left up to the states to decide for themselves. This had the effect of essentially reestablishing the crazy quilt of time described by Moseley, which the Uniform Time Act of 1966 was created to solve. The goal was for the daylight hours to align with the times most people were active, as reflected in a later amendment in 1986 that moved the start of daylight savings time to the first Sunday in April. But this revision was further amended in 2005 as part of clean energy legislation, with daylight savings beginning on the second Sunday in March and lasting until the first Sunday in November. Now, how this relates to drive-in movie theaters is fairly simple. You see, drive-in venues couldn't schedule showtimes to begin until after sunset, because it needed to be dark enough to project the films at all. But they now ran into a problem that daylight savings time shifted everything so that sunset hours were now later in the evening, which meant that by the clock, it stayed lighter later. Put simply, it's not that the law somehow magically governed the rise and fall of the sun, but rather that the time on the clock when sunset happened was later than it used to be. As a result, showtimes were starting later, and because showtimes were starting later, you couldn't schedule as many showings. With fewer showings on average, you would need each showing to draw a bigger crowd to make up the difference. And the family crowds who'd been part of the makeup of the drive-in since their inception were choosing other activities, since the later showtimes made it harder for them to justify attending on a school night or a work night. It was a matter of being able to get home at 9 o'clock from a traditional movie theater showing versus getting home at like 11 o'clock from the drive-in. With that said, daylight savings time still had positive effects in other areas of society, as it supposedly led to a decrease in crime and fewer traffic accidents. But this was cold comfort for drive-in theater owners, who began to resort to showing riskier films for this new audience of night owls, even riskier than those X-rated films that they'd shown previously. And they had the option to show those riskier films because we were now in a period of American cinematic history to allow it. The oppressive and restrictive Hays Code, which had strictly governed what was deemed appropriate to show on film since 1934, was officially put out to pasture in 1968. As a result, there was a certain cinematic liberation that carried into the 1970s, more avant-garde, more adult. And this wasn't just limited to X-rated films like Midnight Cowboy, which in 1970 was awarded the Best Picture Oscar for 1969, making it the only X-rated film to win Best Picture, so feel free to use that on your next trivia night. No, this was about platforming more adult-oriented fare across the board, with boundary-pushing classics like A Clockwork Orange, Last Tango in Paris, The Wild Bunch, and even The Graduate, But embedded within this loosening of restrictions was a lot of campy stuff that didn't have much in the way of auteur appeal, but rather seemed intended to draw in audiences entirely on the premise that you could now see naked people on screen. Never mind that this had already been happening since the start of the 1960s. It had become more widespread as the Hays Code was phased out, and kicked into overdrive with its banishment. I'm talking movies like horrors of Spider Island, The Playgirls and the Vampire, and then goofball stuff that was virtually impossible to take seriously, like Dracula Has Risen from the Grave and Flesh Gordon. There was arguably greater variety at the drive-in now than there had ever been, for better or worse, but theaters were still struggling to turn profits on their loyal patrons, which meant some theaters needed to find other ways to make money off of the drive-in that hadn't already been thought of. Arcadia, California's famous Edwards Drive-In began holding weekend swap meets starting in 1968, and these meets carried on into the 1970s. In fact, they drew so many patrons, it made parking virtually impossible for members of the church across the street, with some 10,000 patrons attending per day on the weekends at its peak. It got to the point that the Edwards was legitimately earning more money as a swap meet destination than as a drive-in movie theater. Not that the Edwards didn't still try to make the drive-in profitable, as they started to show X-rated movies at a time just before the term X-rated became synonymous with skin flicks. You see, because the Motion Picture Association of America never bothered to actually trademark the X rating, adult filmmakers started to use it as a promotional tool for their own movies by creating their own internal MPAA rating system, with one X denoting a relatively tame film, two X's denoting something wilder, and three X's, well, you know what triple X means. And it's not Vin Diesel. This became a problem because Hollywood studios were still using the X rating, but people were becoming aware of its alternate definition as the adult industry started to become commercially viable, albeit not mainstream. So newspapers refused to advertise films with an X rating, and theater owners wanted no part of any X films, period, whether they were from Hollywood or from some guy from Hoboken with too much chest hair. Yet some drive-ins continued exhibiting these films, even as the stigma around them grew. And while I can't say it definitely hurt the reputation of drive-in theaters long term, I can't imagine it helped. With declines in business and social standing, venues like the Edwards Drive-In were more than justified in using the space in a way that would allow them to make consistent money. It was reflective of the measures theater owners had to take in order to remain viable in a changing landscape, since the peak of the drive-in had already come and gone, and it was time for the business to sink into its valley. By the late 1970s, the home video era was dawning, with Betamax and VHS VCRs helping to popularize a more private movie night than even the drive-in could hope to offer. Suddenly, the biggest appeal of the drive-in was a non-factor. Because who cares about viewing a movie in the privacy and comfort of your own car when you could see movies in the privacy and comfort of your own home? Sure, they weren't going to be first-run movies, as you needed to wait until the theatrical window passed, and then a while longer before the movie you could have seen in theaters was finally made available on home video, and God help you if it were a Christmas movie, because then you were waiting until the next Christmas for it to finally release on video. But even without VCRs, movies at home had become commonplace thanks to television. I mean, The Wizard of Oz might not have become the generational juggernaut it's been had it not been for the Turner networks broadcasting the film annually. Maybe the movies that Americans were watching on TV and VHS weren't brand spanking new in-theater movies, but they were movies that they previously wouldn't have had the chance to see unless they'd seen them in theaters. Because once a film was out of theaters in the days before VHS, you either had to hope the movie was re-released down the line, or it was eventually shown on TV as a network broadcast premiere. Otherwise, you were basically out of luck. It's why Gone with the Wind may never be topped in ticket sales when adjusted for inflation. Everybody on Earth had to see that movie because they didn't know when they'd get another chance. So the 1970s basically marked the passing of the drive-in from its ironclad, unshakable relevance. However, the 1970s also marked the passing of the drive-in's most influential figure. On May 13th, 1975, Richard M. Hollingshead Jr. passed away in his Villanova, Pennsylvania home at the age of 75. After leaving the theater business, Hollingshead had found personal success as chairman of the chemical firm his father had founded, holding the position until retiring in 1964, after which the family sold their interest in the company. Although Hollingshead never saw the kind of success in the movie business that he probably deserved, he did leave a lasting legacy through the memories of anybody who's ever enjoyed a drive-in movie. I won't say it never would have existed without him, since it clearly would have, but there's something to be said for not only developing an idea, but refining it, so that it creates a foundation for others to build upon. Yet, despite New Jersey being the birthplace of the drive-in movie theater, from what I could find, only one drive-in theater remains standing in the Garden State: the Delsey Drive-In in Vineland, New Jersey. And while its existence represents the resilience of the drive-in theater concept, considering the Delsey opened back in 1949, closed in 1987, and then reopened in 2004, it also represents exactly that, the up and down business of the drive-in, marked by unpredictable highs and crushing declines, as we would see in the 1980s. While there were some technological advancements that made the drive-in more appealing, they were few and far between. For example, while Shankweiler's Drive-In couldn't lay claim to being the first drive-in theater in the world to utilize FM broadcast stereo sound direct to cars, as that honor belongs to the Dromana 3 Drive-In in Melbourne, Australia, Shankweiler's was the first in America to do so, beginning in the 1980s. But even as attendance declined substantially, the drive-in wasn't completely dead yet. If the fall of the drive-in seems fairly curt, it's only because its decline was every bit as sudden and meteoric as its rise, yet not nearly as inexplicable as its resurgence. In the 1980s, VHS and cable television were eroding the consumer base for drive-in movie theaters, yet other factors would continue to chip away at attendance throughout the 1990s. From over 4,000 drive-in theaters at their peak, the number steadily declined so that by the end of the 1990s, fewer than 450 theaters remained. And one of the biggest threats facing their continued sustainability throughout the decade was simple to perceive, but difficult to overcome: real estate. You see, suburbanization may have accelerated in the post-war era, but it continued throughout the Reagan years, with suburban real estate development taking up more space and land values rising. And when you consider that drive-ins were a seasonal operation, it no longer made sense to limit that land's use to something that only made money a few months out of the year. Theaters closed down, and the plots on which they stood Some measuring over 12 acres were sold off to real estate developers, because I guess the world needs more storage units and Dick's Sporting Goods. Ugh. But there was also the issue that cars weren't the novelty they'd once been. So just sitting in one to watch a movie didn't really constitute a date in the same way it did in the 1950s. Not even for children, what with in-car entertainment systems and all that. But even if watching a movie in your car somehow still constituted a date, the types of cars that were popular were no longer really conducive to the drive-in experience. And the reason is, once again, geopolitical in nature. The 1973 and 1979 oil crises resulted in fuel shortages and outrageous lines at gas stations across the country. People were literally fist-fighting over gas, throwing hands for a spot in line to fill up, running the fade for that 87 octane. Similarly to when fuel was being rationed during World War II, there wasn't enough gas to go around. So people weren't really going to the drive-in, and the cars that took the place of those gas-guzzling land yachts were smaller, imported cars that made viewing a film at the drive-in a less attractive proposition. Gone were the wide, wraparound windshields and spacious cabins with bench seating. I mean, sure, you still had your Lincoln Continentals and your K5 Blazers and your Cadillac Eldorados and your Ford Country Squire wagons, both new and used models. But you also had the Volkswagen Beetle, the Honda Civic, the Toyota Corolla, and even smaller American offerings like the Ford Pinto and the AMC Pacer. Muscle cars were still in their prime in the 70s with the Chevy Camaro, the Dodge Challenger, the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, and yes, the Mustang too. By which I mean the Mustang also, but also the Mustang too. And yeah, you could absolutely take any of these cars to the drive-in. Nothing precluded you from doing so. But I don't think it would be the same experience as you would have had in your traditional land barge. And even as we got into the minivans and the station wagons of the 80s and 90s, and the burgeoning era of the SUV and the crossover, I just feel like the drive-in movie was probably lower on the list of considerations of benefits for a larger family-sized car. But then I do think that's probably a fringe theory on my part. A far more realistic, though likely underrepresented factor in the drive-in's decline is that they were also competing with shopping malls, some of which had their own movie theaters. So instead of going to the drive-in to sit in their car, kids of the 80s and 90s were cruising around town or going to the mall, and if they happened to want to see a movie, they'd probably just see one there. Because a drive-in was mostly a one-use space, especially now that most of them didn't have the crazy gimmicks anymore. You went to see a movie at a drive-in and that was all you could really do. But at a mall, there's other stuff to do. There are arcades, there's shopping, food courts, etc. So people just chose the mall instead. And this is before even mentioning movie rental stores. The advent of VHS was bad enough when customers could only purchase a movie for home viewing, because at least then they were limited by income in how many films they could afford to see at home, since VHS cassettes weren't exactly cheap. In the late 70s and early 80s, you were sometimes paying between $50 and $100 for a single movie. But video rental stores changed the game by making a variety of films accessible at a significantly lower price point, so that you could rent multiple films on a single trip, and even if you return them late, the total cost of the rental with the late fees would likely be less than the cost of purchasing a new movie outright. By the 1990s, movie rental stores were an integral part of the movie-going experience, as much as indoor theaters themselves, which continued to expand with multiplexes that were difficult for drive-ins to match. 1 or 2 screens can't really compete with 6, 8, 10, 12 screens. Multiplexes had always been a part of cinema consumption, but you really started to see how much more vital they were to the cinema landscape in the post-Jaws era of summer blockbuster filmmaking. Because these were increasingly expensive movies that needed more showings in order to make back all the money and hopefully turn a profit. So studios wanted their films on as many screens for as many showings as possible. And your average 1 or 2 screen drive-in couldn't really give you that. Some had more, sure, but generally speaking, that's all you got. And studios mostly viewed this as a worse value for their bottom line. For instance, in 1996, with 1 or 2 screens, you could stagger movies like Twister and Mission Impossible. But a multiplex could screen both those movies, plus Independence Day, The Rock, and The Nutty Professor at the same time. And blockbusters would only get bigger and more expensive, and drive-ins became more difficult for studios to justify sending multiple prints to. They did, of course, but they saw which way the winds were blowing. They saw how their audiences consumed movies. And over time, filmmaking became more and more technologically ambitious. Men in Black, The Matrix, The Phantom Menace, Spider-Man, Transformers, The Dark Knight, the MCU. As movies became more expensive and more technologically advanced, so did the methods of screening them, which further left drive-in movie theaters out of the conversation, because the final nail in the drive-in's coffin was the conversion from film to digital. Put simply, when studios stopped sending physical film reels, theater owners had to convert to digital projectors. But digital projectors weren't cheap, and it was a huge expense for family-owned or smaller drive-in theaters to incur that expense, particularly at a time when revenue was lower than it had ever been. The 2000s were even worse than the 90s, and now studios were basically telling theater owners that they had to upgrade all of their equipment or risk not having access to first-run features anymore. The cost for converting a single screen could reach the mid-5 figures, and significantly higher if you were among the drive-ins with multiple screens, because those costs weren't just for the projector. It was for the media server, the sound processing unit, and HVAC systems to prevent overheating. A 2013 report by Michigan's MLive noted that one local drive-in upgraded 2 of their projectors to digital at a cost of $144,000. Meanwhile, Shankweiler's drive-in theater upgraded to digital at a cost of roughly $120,000 in 2013. That same year, Time reported on a Vermont-based drive-in that had to take up donations as part of a Save the Drive-In campaign to raise $70,000 for a digital projector upgrade. The drive-ins that couldn't afford to convert to digital had to resort to showing older films or simply shut down altogether. By 2014, the number of theaters had fallen from 450 to around 348. And the odds of the drive-in ever bouncing back were lower than a stanced E36. But, notably, those odds weren't zero. Streaming, YouTube, and the diversification of content finished the job that VHS tapes, DVDs, rental stores, and digital projectors started. By the end of the 2010s, the drive-in mostly existed as a nostalgic artifact that earned business as a novelty. That wonderfully quaint thing you did in the summers and only when the very specific mood struck. The ones that upgraded still got first-run movies, while the remainder operated through specialty, themed nights and double and triple features centered around one director or actor or genre. The drive-ins were not at the peaks that they enjoyed 50, 60 years earlier. But it was a living. Yet all that was about to change in the most unexpected way imaginable. The pandemic in 2020 resulted in mass lockdown orders, limiting business hours or shutting them down altogether. Beginning in March 2020, entertainment options were mostly limited to streaming. Watching movies at home, which had been so appealing in the 80s and 90s, had suddenly started to feel like a prison movie night. People wanted to get out and do something, but going anywhere risked exposure to a virus that was claiming lives. So what's an activity you could do that got you out of the house but didn't require you to be exposed to other people for prolonged periods of time? Drive-ins got people out of the house for something other than work or grocery shopping, and it kept them safely isolated in their vehicles so they didn't have to come into contact with anyone. Not even a ticket taker, since that was all online by this point. But not only did it save people's social sanity, it also saved the movie theater industry as a whole. From late March to mid-August 2019, drive-ins accounted for just 2.9% of the North American box office. During that same period in 2020, 85%. And attendance for drive-in movie theaters continued once restrictions were lifted, even if it didn't come close to the peak during lockdown. As CNN noted a year later, quote, "Through the first 30 weeks of 2021, drive-ins are still gobbling up a greater share of box office revenue than they did pre-pandemic, averaging 6.2% of weekend box office dollars this year versus nearly 1.9% for the first 30 weeks of 2019, ComScore data show." End quote. Drive-ins had reclaimed so much popularity that formerly abandoned or closed venues were now being eyed for reopening. With the sudden resurgence in attendance and the revenue that went along with it, theaters were now able to modernize, not just with digital projection screens so they could show first-run movies from major studios, but with new features like app-based concession ordering with no-contact delivery direct to your car. Now, of course, the pandemic was a special situation, and the gains that drive-ins witnessed during the better part of 2 years weren't going to be the new norm. However, in the years that followed, drive-ins settled into a kind of stable existence, and Gen Z has a big part in that. And maybe even Gen Alpha, too. Similarly to baby boomers in their youth, teens today don't really have third spaces. Businesses are hostile to their presence, and the spaces that my generation had growing up, like the malls, the diners, and the parks, all that stuff is slowly disappearing. But the drive-in is a place you can go to catch a movie in something resembling privacy. That doesn't mean spending half the night mulling over what to pick on Netflix before just settling on Rizzoli and Isles. Drive-ins have also caught on as a trendy sort of space, a place to post about on social media. And because they didn't really grow up with these spaces, it isn't necessarily nostalgic for them. It's something entirely new. Which is not to say that nostalgia doesn't play a part in drive-ins continuing to operate, what with all the retro-themed nights and audiences that include demographics who are old enough to remember when the drive-in was the place to be. Nostalgia is huge across culture, but particularly in these types of spaces, where some of these theaters survive solely on the basis of classic movies. With that said, drive-ins are still going to face challenges in the years ahead. For one, the costs of operating are still significant because you're not occupying a brick and mortar space that may have already been erected. You're buying up land, you're building on or paving that land, you're maintaining that land, and you're paying astronomical leasing prices for the privilege. This is likely why concessions are so damn expensive, because they need to make up the difference to justify keeping the drive-in open at all. But then there are also issues with studios that charge a significant fee for each film screened. While you would think the multiplex is paying significantly more because that cut being paid to the movie studio is spread across a dozen screens rather than one or two, a multiplex also has more showtimes, meaning more opportunities to sell tickets to cover those fees. Drive-ins, as we've established, have limited hours and seasons of operation, in addition to fewer screens. So having to pay the studio rental terms for each film is going to be a bigger hit to a mom-and-pop drive-in than your sit-and-dine multiplex with a built-in bar and a kitchen in the back. Some drive-ins simply aren't going to survive, which is really sad. However, I would also argue that it makes the survivors all the more impressive for their resilience, because this is a specific market that the movie industry nearly killed. You could even say they've been trying to kill it through their apathy and inflexibility, rather than through any specific intention. No one thought to preserve the drive-in because it was never viewed as being worthy of preservation, yet it had value. It still has value, not just to cinephiles, but to automotive enthusiasts everywhere. But if you narrow it down, if you really get to the root of it all, the enduring nature of the drive-in movie theater is the story, not its birth and not its death, but just its survival. Because that says more about the value of drive-in movie theaters and their merit in American culture and American automotive culture than its beginning, its downfall, and even its peak ever could. Two years ago, we partnered with the Mahoning Drive-In Theater in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, for a screening of Christine, the film adaptation of Stephen King's novel about a killer Plymouth Fury. It's one of my favorite memories of all my time doing RCR, and oddly, while I tend to do car show videos for each one of our meets where I kind of riff on the cars that are there, this was the rare one where I gave myself permission not to feel obligated to make content out of something, to allow myself to just enjoy the atmosphere and be present in the moment. And I'm trying to get better about allowing myself to do that, but either way, I saw old friends and I met new ones, and then sat in my Camry as the overcast, muddy day gave way to a perfect dark that set the mood, along with the retro advertisements and piping hot grub from the concession stands. And believe it or not, I'd never actually seen Christine, not in full anyway, and not only was it wonderful, but I couldn't think of a better place to have seen it for the 100th time, much less for the first. And the wonder of that experience is all the more precious to me because of how perilously close it came to never happening. During the pandemic, the Mahoning nearly got bulldozed in favor of a solar farm. Now, the Mahoning has been an institution in Pennsylvania, even if not to the same extent as the nationally renowned Shankweilers, which not only continues to thrive today, but switched to year-round operation in 2022. The Mahoning has literally been around since 1949, and it's seen all the dizzying highs of the drive-in theater boom and the less than savory lows, such as in 1997, when the Mahoning's then owner was fed up at having his zoning applications for 2 new screens denied, so he threatened to screen Deep Throat and Debbie Does Dallas. And while the crisis was eventually averted, let it be known that the drive-in movie theater is that serious. This is not a business to be taken lightly. Projectionist Jeff Maddox took over operations in 2002 and became the Mahoning's new owner in 2014. And he managed to find success by screening old B movies and cult classics, and holding the kinds of themed nights that would eventually buoy so many other drive-in theaters during those lean years in the 2010s. And in that way, the Mahoning found new life, and audiences rediscovered their love for drive-in movies. And so, when solar company Green Skies Clean Energy proposed converting the Mahoning into a solar farm back in 2021, the community fought back with a Save the Mahoning Theater rally in August of that year. And their passion compelled the company to stand down. In a statement, Green Skies would declare, quote, "We were not aware of the cultural significance and nostalgic value the theater represented. We now recognize the importance of the Mahoning Drive-In to the community of Lehighton and film enthusiasts far and wide." End quote. On a bittersweet note, while he lived to see the Mahoning saved, Jeff Maddox would sadly pass away just prior to the theater's 75th anniversary in 2024. The master projectionist who discovered 35mm film projection during his time in the Air Force left the Mahoning better than he found it. And from what I could find, I believe this is the last remaining drive-in in America to offer only 35mm retro film programming. But please feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm wrong about that. But more poignantly, Maddox lived to see the drive-in regain some of the luster it had lost in the preceding decades, and reclaim some measure of relevance in a shifting entertainment landscape. And I mention Jeff Maddox here in this epilogue, this late stage, not because his story is a local one, but because I think his story is one that proves that the past is not so easily discarded, and that time-worn avenues of cinematic memory are not so easily forgotten. That screening of Christine was one of the highlights of my year, and it wouldn't have happened if the Mahoning had gone under. So thank you, Jeff Maddox, and thank you to the Mahoning, and to drive-in theater operators everywhere. Now, while the drive-in definitely does have challenges ahead, it has every possibility of actually growing over the next couple of years. A 2026 business research company study notes that the drive-in movie theater market is expected to grow from $4.96 billion in 2026 to $6.86 billion by 2030, citing key market drivers including increased demand for outdoor leisure activities and strategic partnerships such as those between theaters and movie studios. While we've long passed the point where you can literally watch a movie inside your car thanks to sophisticated in-car entertainment systems, theater operators are betting on the unique environment of a drive-in theater and the singular experience it provides. I mean, by all rights, the notion of the drive-in ever being relevant again should have been utterly preposterous, yet there isn't really anything else like it. There's a certain vitality to a drive-in, an electric feeling of engagement that is, in some ways, greater than that of a traditional movie theater because it naturally blocks out all the annoying people, like the talkers and the full brightness phone scrollers. Short of pulling up old Weather Channel playlists, it just might be the closest thing we have to time travel, since it's hard not to feel like you've been transported to an entirely different era. Throughout this video, I've referred to drive-ins as a novelty, and maybe in their current incarnation, they kind of are. But to the people who grew up with them, who came of age underneath those silver screens, it wasn't a novelty. in the same way being a mall rat wasn't a novelty to me in my youth. It was just life. But unlike loitering at malls, it seems like drive-ins are making enough of a comeback to no longer be considered a novelty even now, but rather a normal part of the cinematic landscape. And I love that for us. We've become so wonder-starved that I think we've forgotten how to let life's simplest joys resume their wonder, so that something as matter-of-fact as a movie projected on a screen out in the open air on a summer night can impress us and carry with it all the weight of human memory. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching this if you've made it this far. This has been kind of a passion project for me. I started writing it, I want to say, around 4 years ago, and I've been chipping away at it little by little ever since. You can even go on the second channel, Regular and Roman, and, go back in our archives and find a live stream of me where I read out the first draft of the script and take feedback from the audience. And that's how long I've been working on this. It's been years, and granted, I don't know that it's reflected in the style of video that I make, but I hope it's reflected in the types of scripts that I write, because I didn't just come in knowing any of this. I had to do a lot of reading, but this was stuff that I wanted to learn about and wanted to know about, and I love doing these videos. This is my favorite thing that I do on the channel is RCR Stories, and so I love it when I get the opportunity to make more of them, and I don't always have the time to do that, but I hope that I can find the time and that it won't be another case of something that takes years. Now, if you like these videos and want me to make more of them, Patreon is the absolute best way to support this, because for $1, it's linked in the description. For just $1, you can get these videos early and ad-free. But barring that, just like, comment, subscribe. Share the video with someone you think might enjoy it, and tap the bell icon just so that you get notified for every new video. Merch links are in the description if you want to support the channel that way. But either way, your viewership is enough. I hope you know that. And that I deeply and truly appreciate you giving me any piece of your time, because I know how valuable time is. So thank you so much for watching, and have an outstanding rest of your week.